Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session today. I've got a really exciting conversation planned for us. We just heard an amazing presentation from Kayvon Karimi of Microsoft. If you didn't catch that one, please go check it out. I think he gave a great perspective from Microsoft's view of how the automotive industry and its ecosystem is very complex. That's actually, Jen and I are going to elaborate on that a little bit more. So before I introduce our wonderful guest and also myself, I just want to give an overview of kind of what we're planning here today. So the title of this session is how automotive is the heart of IoT. Over our coffee, sometimes we talk about how the automotive industry is really kind of a cool area where technology really has advanced so much over the years. So there's so much digital acceleration, especially with connectivity and the mobility industry, where the car used to be kind of a simple mechanical machine that would ride down the road, get you from point A to point B. Now we're talking about basically rolling computers with 100 to 150 million lines of code, which we've heard this statistic before, but for those who haven't, a passenger plane has a fraction of that, maybe 15 million. So don't quote me on those numbers because they're always changing. But basically, the car is a very, very complex computer, not just a mechanical machine. So when Jennifer and I were planning this session, talking specifically about automotive, the history of automotive cybersecurity and how it intersects with the IoT world, we realized that automotive is really the heart of IoT. So that's where the title of this presentation came from. Automotive was one of the first major industries to connect, really. We had the OnStar systems that GM put out, I think, in the 90s. I think that was the late 90s when that came out. And since then, we've seen more and more parts of the car become more and more connected, which means more and more attack surface and different vectors to get into the vehicle. So we've seen this technology progress over the years, and we want to give a little bit of background on automotive security, kind of where it was born, if you will, where it started, where we are today, and then looking forward into the future of technology when we start talking about things like self-driving vehicles and V2V, V2X, the vehicle connections to the infrastructure. So I will give a little overview of myself, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jen to give her introduction. But my name's Amy Chu. I'm the Vice President of Customer Success at Device Authority. My background is electrical engineering, although once I got into electrical engineering, I found that I really appreciated tinkering more with the people designing the electronics than the electronics themselves. So I got into automotive program management, and that's where I spent the majority of my career. And that is a job that is not for the faint of heart. It's an area that basically touches every piece of the development. I was at a tier one supplier for a while. But you get to see the complexity of the automotive ecosystem in the whole product life cycle too, not just at the design phase or even the manufacturing phase, but even well into warranty and service. So I landed in cybersecurity shortly after the infamous GPAC, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But I fell in love with cybersecurity and also the cyber physical aspect of automotive is unique in some regards. I'm sure Jen will talk about that too. So while I was at Harman, I got involved over there. I said, that's a place I'm really interested in checking out. So I helped stand up the Cybersecurity Center of Excellence there. All the automotive companies were scrambling, scrambling is probably not the best word, working swiftly to get their engineering teams up to speed in cybersecurity. And so I was a part of that at Harman, and not only getting the engineering design practices aligned with cybersecurity design, but then also vulnerability management, incident response, those types of things. So I took on a role with the Automated Safety Consortium after that, where I actually worked on the safety side. It wasn't so much focused on cybersecurity, but whenever we talk about cybersecurity with vehicles or any cyber physical system, safety is the most critical thing. And you heard that from Kayvon as well. So I would like to introduce my co-panelist here. And if you haven't figured out, we're going to do kind of a conversation style here. But this is Jennifer Tisdale. Jennifer is the CEO of Grim Cyber, engineering and consulting firm specializing in cyber physical systems. And Jen, if you want to take a few moments to give your background and kind of what you think is important today.
Explain myself, right? It's my chance to explain myself.
Yes. Thank you.
So thanks, Amy, and thanks for inviting me to be here with you today, because I feel like it's such an important conversation. And though we have it with each other quite a bit, we don't often get the opportunity to share with a wider audience. And so I think it's really exciting for us to maybe share some of our experiences and our thoughts on where the industry is going at large, because it has changed and continues to change and might even change again before we finish this conversation.
Yeah.
But my background is not in engineering. I feel like I open every panel with that. I have a slightly different background than most of my counterparts. My background is in economics, policy, and public relations, oddly enough. But I started my career in this space about 10 years ago, I guess slightly longer than 10 years ago now, 2012. I can't believe it's been more than 10 years. Where I was introduced to a new area of economic development, where I was tasked with building out. I'm in the state of Michigan. I'm in Metro Detroit. Automotive kind of courses through my veins, as I'm sure it does yours as well. Long family histories to the auto industry, as many people in our region have. But I was tasked by our governor at that time to build out the economic strategy for Michigan as it would relate to cybersecurity. So he was a nerd by his own admission, had a passion for IT, technology, and cybersecurity, and needed somebody to help develop the plan for economic strategy. And what that would mean is, how do you pull in new businesses to the state? How do you grow the industries that are already there? How can you invest more strategically to create the right ecosystem that would grow talent and business and opportunity for a particular region? And when I first started that path, I was very overwhelmed. I believe I might have even cried once or twice trying to figure out how I was going to make this happen. But the more investigation and research that I had done, I quickly realized that it wasn't too outside the automotive industry space to be this innovative. It is true that they're doing more innovation today and in the last decade than they have in maybe the 75 years prior. And so we're feeling it at a rapid pace, but that all brings opportunity. And I think both you and myself and many of our colleagues would not be here today if the industry hadn't started this, rapid pace of change. So it's exciting, it's thrilling, it's exhilarating, it's stressful, it's strainful. But what we're seeing now in the last decade is this new reimagining of what the auto industry is. And so when we built out 10 years ago in the state of Michigan, where I am, the X strategy, we knew we couldn't be Silicon Valley. We'd likely not be what's happening in Texas or in the DC area in the US or other pockets around the globe. We had to find our unique niche. What made us different? And the auto industry made us different in relation to cybersecurity. The research indicated that all things were pointing towards the electronics of the vehicle. How do we become more connected, automated, and autonomous systems were largely a part of the conversation in very quiet corners of the industry, if you will, and even more quiet were conversations around cybersecurity. And so 2012 being 3 years prior to the GPAC of 2015, there was not a lot of eagerness to talk about cybersecurity because it was sort of, taboo almost, right? Like, because we wanted to be able to create a narrative that embraced technology, that advocated for the future of mobility, though we didn't have the word mobility then, still belonged to the healthcare industry.
Yeah.
So we were, really trying to, garner our roots and figure out, how do we take what we already do really well as an industry and grow it and cultivate it so that it can be deployed into the world in this larger way. And what would that mean? And to be quite honest, and I can't speak on behalf of all industry, but a lot of the questions didn't have answers, right? I didn't want to say we were building the car as we were driving it. to change the phrase slightly, but we kind of were. We kind of knew that we had to do things differently. We had to be able to embrace industry in a new way, and what that supply chain for the automotive industry would look like would wholly change, which through some twists and turns in my career path, I did some time with an automotive OEM, led their cybersecurity programming for their R&D team with connected vehicle. And I just really fell in love with the company that I'm with now, and not just the company, though they're great, but the work that they're doing in that future focused cybersecurity practitioner perspective of, yes, tech is great, but we want to deploy it responsibly. We want to be able to understand where there are weaknesses in the tech and how we might help mitigate those risks. And so, being with Grim Cyber now, and there are other companies like us that get deployed to do the testing. I like to say we have the best gig in cyber is we get hired to do the break, and then it's companies like yours that get to figure out how to fix it. um, but we love being sort of at the forefront. The difficulty is, and I'm sure you've experienced it, is there's no template for this, right? Like,
Right.
this industry is very new, very emerging, and even now, 10 years after the first discussion that I was a part of, we're starting to see some maturity, such as indicated by the presenter right before us, right, talking about standardization and what that looks like, and how do we get global kind of harmony, if these have to be interoperable from state to state and country to country. And so it's fun to watch this thing that was very fledgling start to grow and mature, but still have a little bit of work to do, as you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, I agree, Jen. And I picked up on so many things in your explanation there. One I want to pick at really quick because I didn't even realize this. Wow, 2012. That's that's quite a bit before a lot of these discussions were happening. Because
Mhm,
if we go back, if we talk a little bit more about the history, the past, if you will, of
mhm,
automotive cybersecurity, I got involved in about 2016. So that was sort of the recovery period of the GPAC. Um, but before that, I mean, and even after that, it was still, these were still taboo topics. These were still very difficult to talk about because of the complexity of the
mhm,
topic itself, and also the education that was needed for the whole community, basically. We had always been looking at our products, as vehicles. They were already becoming more and more connected,
mhm,
but the focus was on the functionality, right? And safety, because inherent within automotive, safety has always been something that the OEMs and suppliers were focused completely on. So it was sort of a weird paradigm shift that had to happen where this gigantic industry that's been around for over 100 years has to now like sort of change their thinking, which I think was interesting. So, um, is there anything you could tell more about that period between 2012 and 2016? Maybe the journey that kind of went from did you see, let me rephrase. Did you see a change within that 4-year time period that you were involved prior to? Like, was it progressing then, or was it kind of just staying where it was at?
yeah, and full disclosure, where I first started to notice that everything was going more towards connectivity within the vehicle platform itself wasn't necessarily in commercial automotive.
Mm,
It was harbored with U.S. military, with
uh,
ground vehicle systems for the U.S. Army, and heavy truck, heavy vehicles. So as you might imagine, a joint lightweight tactical wheeled vehicle is pretty heavy. It has a lot of similarities to what we would see in the heavy trucking community, a lot of the same components and parts and architecture. The connectivity is different, right? And the reason for connectivity is very different. But we were starting to see a lot with autonomy,
mm,
largely with robotics, things that would be deployed in theater for active combat. Um, and knowing that a lot of the innovation that we were seeing within the DoD space would sort of migrate into commercial automotive just by proxy of the supply chain. So they're already developing these widgets and components for one area of their business, and on the other side of their portfolio would be able to be pretty easily deployed or supplied on the passenger vehicle side of the house. So there are leader follower technologies with, for military applications that will probably be deployed in commercial trucking in the not too distant future, with continued shortages, driver shortages, unable to recruit and retain the right talent to do those jobs. So if they could have one driver and 4 or 5 follower units behind the one single with the manual human in the loop driver, that helps to curb a lot of the talent shortages that people or companies are claiming that they have. But it was shortly thereafter. So that would have been 2012, 2013. I was largely focused on our defense interests in terms
Okay.
of connectivity and autonomous systems and what that would look like. And that started curiosity for me for what was happening in commercial automotive. So again, I was serving one state, but the industries were global.
Mm.
So I'd start knocking on doors and asking questions, and like anyone doing applied research, trying to get some insider perspective. In 2012 and 13, those doors were largely closed in my face, quite
Oh, yeah.
honestly.
Wow.
They were either questions that they didn't want to disclose in a public way, or they just simply didn't have the answers. I can't um, project to you what the answer is, which scenario that is, right? But I have my assumptions is that maybe they were questions that did not yet have full answers, so they can't speak about it publicly, right?
Right.
And so as we tipped 2013 into 2014, and a lot of it is so relational that if you're an outsider, you're less likely to be brought in under somebody's wing, but if you're persistent enough, people will start to appreciate you. And if you're transparent enough,
Right.
helpful enough, people will start to share, right? And so it was just questions, and it was held in confidence, and it was just more, I don't want to say theoretical, but what happens when? What happens when we put connected cars on the road? How will we manage that? What will that mean to other areas of public administration, right? Like, what does it mean if a connected vehicle runs a red light and the technology is driving the vehicle, right? Or if there's like
Right.
autopilot, TM, I guess, not to use somebody else's tech or to single anyone out, but say there's an incident with the tech that
Yeah.
creates a scenario where the vehicle does something that is against the law, or causes an accident or what have you, right? And those questions did not yet have answers. I don't know
Mhm.
that they even yet still have full answers, because we've not had a lot of scenarios, thank goodness, like that, but we're starting to see um, going on autopilot does not mean that you can fall asleep at the wheel. It doesn't
Right.
mean, right? There are laws and regulatory things that need to be addressed. What does it mean for law enforcement? Can we use
Right.
OnStar to slow your car down or bring you to a full stop instead of a high speed chase? These are things that um, at state government you're concerned about. Like, you
Yeah.
have an interest in. You're like, how am I going to address these problems? How am I going to ready the state for these concerns? So as I started presenting and positioning my questions from that perspective of like, we have like true interest in this, not because we want to be nosy or in your business. We don't want to be government in your private sector business. But we do have things that we need to think about also.
Yeah.
We can support the deployment of these platforms, deployment being a very governmental word, I guess. So sorry for that.
Okay.
um, but how are we going to support that? What is the ecosystem that needs to be developed? How are we going to manage it? And so as we had those conversations, increasingly they became more receptive. And then 2015 happened. I think it was also June 2015.
I think so.
Yeah, so the Jeep hack happened, and for me, not yet in the auto industry at that time, is the best thing that ever happened in my career. People were
I
willing to
bet.
they were willing to talk, at
I
least.
bet. Well, and that's why I asked. That's why I asked, because I think it's important to know that this was being talked about before, but then something happens that sort of shifts the trajectory, and that's what the GPAC was
It really
for.
was the tipping point, quite
Yes, for
honestly.
auto.
And I hope that we don't have to experience multiple tipping points
Yeah.
to be able to get people to understand the importance of cybersecurity.
Yes.
and what needs to happen to help ensure. And we're never going to have 100% cyber resilience because the
Right.
threat changes all the time,
Mhm.
technology changes all the time. But I think we have to do better as a community of interested professionals that are supporting this space, whether you're OEM, supplier, tier one, two, three, or further down the chain, or you work in state government and you're trying to ensure safety for your citizens.
Mhm.
We have to be working together. It really does
Yeah.
need to be all of us.
For sure. And I think that really points to, again, the topic of this whole chat here is about how automotive being the heart of IoT, IoT being the connected car, as one
Mhm.
example. There are many ECUs within a vehicle that are also connected to all kinds of other things. And it's a very complex ecosystem. So, we talked about the GPAC, we talked about how it happened, it really tipped things over. That's when I joined in. That's when I even found out what is cybersecurity in automotive. I wasn't even thinking about it because I was delivering head units and or sound systems to OEMs
Yeah.
as a program manager. But I had found out about this and got super involved super quick because my company, my tier one, was one of the parties involved in that GPAC, and so there was a lot of efforts that had to be put in place at my company, at the other companies that were affected as well, to address this. All of a sudden, it became front page news, maybe not front page, but it was pretty loud news,
Yeah. In certain
and
circles, right? Like it
yeah,
was
and I mean,
everywhere.
everybody wanted to know what are you going to do about this,
Yeah.
Mr. Automotive Supplier, Mr. Mrs. OEM, and so everybody had to sort of come up with answers. How are we going to do this? And when you were talking about what was going on in the defense industry and in government, and just you were having those conversations already, which was great. Um, Unfortunately, it took something like that to really tip the scales, but that's what it took. So now we're in the place where everybody's kind of we've got their attention, right? And that's where I got involved, and there was multiple different discussion groups, regulatory bodies, lots of people looking at this at that point. And then the issue, I think, you tell me what you think, but my thought on that was um, everybody knew we needed to do something, so everyone started running in a direction of cybersecurity, and there was a lot of claims made about certain products that were going to solve the whole issue. Um, and so I think what happened is we got to a place where we quickly realized how complex this really is. My job that I moved into around 2017 was to get my company in shape in terms of cybersecurity. So that's a checkbox item. No, it's not. It really took a lot of different parts of my organization to come together and really understand what it was we were up against. And we had one of my most I guess I like chaos. That's part of part of
Yeah.
who I am. But I got to experience a couple of researchers that approached me, my company, or my employees, and said, "Hey, I found something," and it was anonymous, and it was a nice tip, but it was like, "Oh, we have to do something about this," and so we walk through as a company, how are we going to address these things, and that got the attention within my organization. But still, a lot of people kind of wanted to put the blinders on and not think about it because it wasn't something that affected our everyday. Um, and so that was going on. I think my opinion is between about 2016 and maybe I don't know, 2020-ish, maybe just a little bit after 2020 was when things really started to take off and really sort of stick. And what I saw was the OEMs were first. They were the ones that put the money into their organizations and stood up like these bigger groups that were focused solely on cybersecurity and designing it in. The tier ones followed, and then it's kind of been successive ever since then. And then my time between where I left cybersecurity and went into automated driving, which was still
Mhm.
it's still a big factor in cybersecurity. But while I was gone, I guess I feel like a lot more has happened in the OT space and the mobility. So I guess if you had to talk about kind of the present day, where we're at today from 2016 on, I mean, where do you feel automotive is at right now?
Well, I mean, we've seen a lot of strides. You know, we've watched the Auto ISAC get stood up,
Hmm.
specifically designed for those of us that are concerned with automotive cybersecurity. We've seen, in fact, a lot of ISACs stood up in the last few years that are dedicated to different pockets of different industries. Um,
And for those who don't know,
Mhm.
ISAC stands for Information Sharing Analysis Center, in case
Thank
you've
you.
not heard of an ISAC. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, so when I was with an OEM, I got to be on the inside of the Auto ISAC and understand, who the makeup of the membership was comprised of, their interests, cares, and concerns, and largely reactive to phone calls like the one you just described. Right? We got an email, we've got a social media, we got a tweet, somebody contacted us and said that there's a vulnerability in something. So we've watched them stand up those incident response plans and have whole teams, in a perfect world, they'd have an entire team, not just one person dedicated to those things. And I think that where we're at right now is, I hate to say it, and tell me I'm wrong if I'm wrong, Amy, based on your view of the world, but I think we've taken almost a step back. Not that we've done enough or we've done everything as an industry that we need to do, but it's almost as though somebody hit the pause button and said, okay, we're going to put ISO 21434 out into the world. People are going to get compliant to that.
I can see that.
We no longer need to rely on insights from the researcher community, right? Like we're going to be proactive here. And what I'm a little bit fearful of for where we are at today and how it might be where we're going tomorrow is if we become too insulated again.
Mm,
If we become, hey, we got this, we have a plan, we understand the risk, we've invested so much money into this, we feel like we're on a good path, and we start to shut those doors again. And when the next Jennifer Tisdale starts knocking on the door asking questions, that we will shut that down. And
mhm.
so I'll save, my next few comments for where I think we're going or where we should be going. But where we're at right now, it's my perception that there's almost a step back, or
Okay.
at least we're standing still.
Mm.
So now that we have some regulations, some best practice, and some standards, and some governing bodies involved, we're going to kind of see how it goes.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a mistake. If that's what's happening, I think it's a mistake. I think that we should be more collaborative than ever before. That this mobility conversation is not simply about the auto industry. It can't be. It has to be about the critical infrastructure community, especially as we tip into electric vehicles, EV infrastructure, and connectivity into the grid. My DoD hat puts on a different warning sound than my commercial practice um, hat does, but I think that there are concerns on both sides that we need to be cognizant of. And then not just from the in vehicle security, but out vehicle. What about that manufacturing environment and IT OT concerns, industrial control systems from the manufacturing floor into the ecosystem, the operating environment, if you will, for the vehicle itself?
Mm.
Um, you know, Adversaries, I'm not going to say hackers, right? Because I love my hackers. But an adversarial hacker is going to look for the easy door, right?
Mhm.
I hate the term low hanging fruit. I can't believe I just said it out loud. But that's what they're looking for. So as we start to increase the resiliency of the vehicle, if we can get in through the infrastructure, they're going to do that. They're
That's
going
a
to get
really
in
good point.
through the charging unit that's in some public parking garage somewhere that nobody does a software update on. I'm going to
Yeah.
go in that way. If I can get in through the radio or via infotainment or telematics or satellite communications or whatever
There's so
it
many
is,
options too
and
with
the
the number of
more we
ECUs
connect, right? The
that are
more we
connected,
connect
yeah.
the vehicle, the more options we have. If I
Right.
can take my phone to my car, how much of that data? I mean, we're talking about physical safety, but we're also talking about personal data safety as well, security.
Correct.
um, it's limitless. And I think this is why people put their blinders on because they're like, that's somebody else's job.
Yeah.
But we're all a part of it. We're all a part of that conversation.
We are, and I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Jen, because I do agree with you. I don't know for certain if we actually are on pause or if it just
Mhm.
appears that way. I'm guessing that it's probably close to where maybe, like you said, a little step back, because then we're kind of down to maybe a smaller group of people that are waving their arms and saying, "Oh my gosh, we have to really look at this. We have to collaborate more." And then maybe um, the larger parts of those companies are not necessarily looking at it as a priority anymore, because it's just, well, we've got these regulations now, so we should be good, right? And as you and I both know, regulations solve part of a problem, a very small part in some cases. But really, especially when we were talking about ISACs and information sharing, to me, that was the magic of it. It was the all of the folks in the industry that were sharing information with each other about potential vulnerabilities or ways that adversaries could get into vehicles, get into plants. So I know that those conversations are still happening, but I might agree with you that, maybe they're not as loud as we were maybe 2 years
And
ago.
and it might depend on the corner of the world to which you're in, right?
True.
To which you're exposed the most. The EU's been doing, I think, from on the other side of the globe, it appears the EU is doing great work with cyber regulation or regulatory framework, especially for new emerging areas such as connected and automated vehicles. We don't have as robust of a regulatory framework here in the US. We have a lot of best practices, we have some standardization. I think the thing we have to be cognizant of and careful about when it comes to things like regulation and policy making is that the amount of time, at least stateside, that it takes to get policy through the system, voted on and approved and put out into the world, all of the tech could change in the
Hmm.
amount of time it takes to get that policy made. So to do smart policy, meaning it has to be worded loosely enough that the intention of the policy is known and viable, but it allows you the ability to pivot slightly if you need to, because tech has changed in the last 5 years since you first introduced it, right? And I don't know that lawmakers in the US have quite figured that out. Um, there is sensitivity and understanding to the timeline of tech and how quickly it can expire, which makes them put their hand up and be like, we don't want to necessarily say, thou shalt do X. Two
Hmm.
reasons. One, by the time we get that through, it's old and outdated. Two, the second we say, thou shalt do X, that's all you're going to do is X. And the adversary will know what you're becoming compliant to and change the game. They will go after something else. And they know there's no way to assure security across the platform, across the entire IoT ecosystem of the car.
Right.
And so it becomes a real headbanger.
Mm.
And so I appreciate why people are like, I can't do this. I can't look at this because we just keep jumping down rabbit holes, but we have
Mhm.
to. We cannot be afraid of it. We have to be pioneers in this space, and we must at least make attempts to mitigate risk
Yeah.
and not have that next cyber tipping point that happens in automotive.
Right, right. Well, and I don't know, I'm thinking in terms of, one of the reasons that I joined Device Authority, frankly, is because the product that we have solves one of those niche
Yeah.
areas. It's very specific, and I think sometimes cybersecurity can be quite overwhelming. Headbanger, I like the phrase you use, because it's like, oh my gosh, it's coming from everywhere. But
Yep.
there are some things that we can do, um, that we can take steps right now that could be fairly easier to take. Um, I believe, in our product, that it is one of those real, essential areas for building this trustworthiness throughout the ecosystem. So I would like to see as well, maybe more education, and that comes through talking to each other. And we've
Mhm.
seen it happen over the course of the last decade, that education, that awareness is the first step. And then maybe breaking things down and having companies work together on different parts of that ecosystem, I think, could be a way forward.
I think somebody once described this whole thing to me, this whole emerging industry to me as an onion. right? Like all the
Mhm.
layers of an onion, and that there were many cybersecurity layers that would need to be peeled back to discover where there's weakness or vulnerability, either like true technical vulnerability, like in the code of a vehicle, or just all the layers of all the people that it will take to bring this together. Because everybody has their own niche area of concern, and device authority and the work that you and your team are doing to help mitigate this risk and address the risk is one of those very important layers of this
Mhm.
onion that we are
Yeah.
trying to not cry as we peel it.
Yeah.
But and grim too, right? Grim cyber too, right? Like we know that you can have a new product, you're going to deploy a new tech and integrate it into a system. It has to be tested. You have to do some sort of true research on that and where that risk is, so that you can harden the system where it's weak.
Right.
It's not an answer that only me and my company can make, right? Or you and your company. It's going to take all of us.
Right.
It really is a team sport. I don't know who coined that phrase for cyber, but it does appear to be true, because it's going to take all of us running towards the same goal line, uh,
Yeah.
in harmony with each other. Because the worst thing that can happen is we have 50 million answers to one question, and then we waste more time trying to figure out which way is right. And you just get pulled in too many directions, and that's where
Mhm.
it becomes overwhelming. But to be able to say, hey, this is the goal for now. Like, we
Mhm.
identify these areas. We know that this product solution or these services or some culmination of the two or this in-house team needs to be developed. And I do see we have a question regarding um, regulation. But this is all part of that equation. We need to have some sort of standard, some sort of regulatory body kind of overseeing this, whether that comes stateside through NHTSA and US DOT or what have you. It all has to work together.
Yeah.
I might not like
I
it, but
Yeah, it's a big undertaking, and that question also sort of makes me rack my brain because it's like, is there is there a way to pass a regulation that's gonna, be fast enough for the evolving technology? I don't know that there is. I
I
mean,
don't know that there is, and in truth be told, I'm mostly paying attention to things in the U.S. versus the EU. The ones I'm watching in the EU are ones that my company needs to be compliant to as well,
Mhm.
or certified to in order to do work overseas for us. But I think some of the challenges, I don't know that there is a unilateral answer to that where it's going to work for every state or every country around the
Yeah,
globe. I mean, we know that's probably a hard no. But I think that there are things that can be done to help speed the process along. And I think that takes not just government officials mandating what thou shall or shall not do.
yeah.
It has to be done in conjunction with industry,
Mhm.
and to not just understand what it is today, but what it will look like to the best of our ability to predict what it will look like tomorrow,
Yep.
so that we can play to where the puck is going instead of where it is right now. And that can be really challenging. And here in the states, we have state laws that are happening one off.
Mhm.
Um, so we have to get cohesion from state to state, and so that's where federal um, legislation would be very valuable, would be to harmonize those policymaking efforts if we can get out of our own way long enough to do that.
Yeah, that's the hardest part, I
Mhm,
think. I do like the idea of more public-private partnerships. That's
mhm,
just me. I participated in a few of those, and then while I was with SAE, even on automated driving, you see how tough it is to get those regulations to where they need to be useful. And
mhm.
then also, like you said earlier, you might make a regulation, and then people are so focused on that one thing, they're not doing all the other things that might be helpful in this situation.
And part of that too, part of that equation is also, and I love engineers. I love my
Yes, you
engineers
do.
of all ilk, but it can't just be the engineers at the table.
That's right.
Engineers and policymakers, right? You need to be able to have other thought leaders from other aspects.
Mhm.
And I find that this is where I think that there might be a slight baby step backward, is where I thought the industry was going to be more interested in hearing from outside of themselves, It seems like those opportunities are decreasing again.
Mm,
And so
okay.
if you put your finger in the wind and kind of get a sense for where the wind's blowing, why it's happening, I don't know, but it has retracted a bit.
Mhm.
And so I hope that it might just be maybe a slight shift in the thought process, or maybe there are other things behind the scenes at play that I'm not privy to. But it does seem to be kind of that gap to enter is getting smaller and smaller again.
Yeah.
Public-private partnerships are a great way to reopen and re-engage, because they can be, um, if it's a fear of, if it's a threat or a competitive thing, or whatever it might be, whatever that nuanced issue might be, it seems to be diminished when it is a public-private partnership. There is some
Mhm.
level of security that is introduced, I guess security, pun intended, confidence, where people are more open to talking and sharing a little bit about the problems they're trying to solve.
Yeah. Well, so we're coming up on almost the end here. I wanna make sure we talk about the future and kind of what we're, where are we going? The, um the automotive security future in that full ecosystem when we talk about mobility and infrastructure, biometrics even, there's biometric data that is being used for authentication now,
Mhm.
smart cities, the cloud, the manufacturing facilities that build these things. I mean, that's where like automotive touches all of that. And
Yep.
so if we look towards the future and we kind of do a SWOT analysis where there's strengths in the automotive industry, all that. What's your take on the future? And like we know maybe we're in the gap period, but like what benefits does the automotive industry have in your mind, especially since you look at other industries as well? Are there other
Mhm.
industries we could learn from? What's your take on the future and what we need to set out to do?
Well, and it just occurred to me while you were talking, maybe this is the answer to my own question, that the step back, or the resistance, if you will, to be more collaborative could be because we have too many chiefs and too many cooks in the kitchen, right? We have too
Yeah.
many people who know everything about their area who want to share that, but not enough people who just want to simply listen and learn.
Hmm.
And that could be it. And that tickled my brain when you were talking, because it will be imperative now more than ever, as we tip into the future, to be extra collaborative, because
Mhm.
this no longer will be managed by the companies that are creating and selling this technology. Once it is out in the wild, as we like to say, right, somebody has to be responsible for it. And
Yeah.
that will largely fall to your state governments, to your local governments. It will be other companies that are reselling or adding on to your tech, with aftermarket solutions, right? Which is going to then impact more legislation or legal activity for who's responsible, who's liable, what went wrong, how did this happen, right? And so those conversations just get increasingly inclusive of more stakeholders.
Mhm.
And so the future I see, especially with EVs, not forever will charging infrastructure be free. At some point, somebody's going to
Oh yeah,
capitalize on that, right? And
for
your
sure.
gas stations will change to charging stations, to which you're paying for your charge. All of the road commissions that are doing induction, or looking at doing induction charging for EVs as you drive, and extreme fast charging, that I know our Department of Energy is looking at. The stakeholders for cybersecurity just gets bigger.
Yeah, that's huge too. I mean, and it almost feels like, oh my gosh, let's not let it get away from us before we can kind of
Yeah.
get our arms around it. But it goes back to what you were saying earlier that we really need to continue that collaboration. How you do that when you already have too many cooks in the kitchen and you're adding more cooks, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously, if I had all the answers, Amy, I wouldn't be sitting here with you today. I'd be basking in the
Why
sun and
not? You don't enjoy
sunshine
talking to me?
somewhere.
Come
I think speaking to you from a tropical island.
Okay,
Um,
that's fair.
but but I think that for me, I know that in my company, when we start looking at all the different areas that we should be focused on, you know, we can't. We're a small company. We only have like 29 people in our firm, and we look at several different industries. And so when we have to prioritize where we're going to focus our effort, we prioritize based on when there is a higher impact, safety critical concern that we feel we can be mindful in supporting. Straight away, we usually identify our top three. Automotive is always at the top of the list. It has been the last several years that I've been with Grimm, the last 3 to 4 years. We continuously prioritize automotive and transportation as a whole. But we have to be very focused because we have limited time, limited people, limited financial resources. And that would be my recommendation to other stakeholders in this space. If we can get it narrowed down to our top three,
Mhm.
instead of our top 300,
Yeah,
and try to make change somewhere
yeah.
um, effectively, then at least we would know that it's possible. And
I like that answer a lot, and that's the only way. It goes back to your onion analogy, same thing. I think, a big takeaway for me anyway, and we've talked about this many times, that security is not a feature, it's an action.
yeah.
And it's an ongoing action, I think is what we're really saying. It's something we're always looking at.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm sorry to those listening. I wish there I wish there was a cyber silver bullet, right? Again, we'd be on an island all together. But there's not a magical answer.
no.
It is going to take many of us and it will be ongoing. And when those cars are out in the wild, or it's a public transit system or an EV school bus or whatever the modality of mobility might take, we all have to be mindful of cybersecurity and that evolution into cyber safety, which I don't know that we've had an opportunity to really tease out.
Yeah.
Um, but I know automotive at large, of several years ago anyway, was very hesitant to put safety and security together.
Mhm.
Safety was something that was measurable, far easier to measure a safety impact um,
Yeah.
than a security impact. But I think that we do really need to be looking at them in tandem.
Mhm.
And cyber safety, I think, is something that we'll see in the future as well. I know they never wanted it. They industry never wanted it to be like a 5-star safety rating, cyber safety rating, the way we do airbags and anti-lock brakes. But in watching marketing as of late for other products in the world, cybersecurity is a selling feature now, and it's
Yeah.
how
Well, and that's come up in a
it.
couple of the other
Mhm.
sessions today. It always comes up, right? Where's my 5-star rating for cyber? And I remember when that was like, no way, it'll never happen. But the reason why we said no way it'll never happen is because of that changing aspect of it.
Mhm.
So my thought
Mhm.
to that now is kind of like, okay, maybe maybe you're not 5-star rating in terms of what's what's being rolled off the line, but the
Mhm.
capability of that company that
What are
that
you
sold you.
doing, right? Like,
Yeah,
show me that you're doing something. Maybe you get a half a star for every cyber resilience act that you're taking.
yeah. But there I think you're right. I feel like there has to be something because if there's
Mhm.
not some incentive towards that, then how do we get there? I don't know. We
Yeah.
can't keep spinning our wheels, but, yeah, I mean, that's the future is not easy. There is no
Mhm.
magic silver bullet, we know that.
But
One
it is
question.
exciting. Yep.
Yeah, it's super exciting. One question, and then we'll end the session with, I saw come through. Um, if you're a supplier, if you're an automotive supplier, and maybe you see this in the work that you do, Jen, is there any advice you'd give to the suppliers, like if they're trying to work with the OEMs and they're trying to understand, where do I go? What should I do? How can I help? And what's the answer? Is the answer to start telling the OEMs, oh my gosh, you need to worry about your systems? I think they already know, but
Mhm.
kind of from what you've seen and maybe your take on it, what advice would you give to a supplier of automotive?
That's a big question, Amy.
I know.
Look, my advice to people, so I do operate as a consultant here at Grimm. I do not do pen testing or anything of that nature. I leave that to my engineers. But where I provide consultation is exactly at this level with taking stock for what you know your assets to be, understanding where you're at in terms of cyber action, cyber resilience. If you have nothing, it's almost easier. We can build a plan for you ground up,
Hmm.
those basic fundamental pieces. If I find, or somebody on my team, or some other researcher finds some vulnerability in your system, who are they going to call?
That's right.
Right? If you don't have a portal on your website, a phone number, a Twitter account, or some easy access for that to be reported, you're setting yourself up for a PR nightmare,
Yeah,
especially if it's legit. You take that in, what are you going to do with it? Have an incident response plan. If you don't have an incident response plan, you can start in house with building one out. You can reach outside of your
I did
organization.
that.
You did that, and there are a lot of free resources, right?
Yeah.
Like this is not a commercial for me, right? You can go to CISA or CISA or however the hell they say their agency name, right? They have a lot of free resources for building out an incident response plan. It won't be unique to your company, but it's
Right.
a good foundation. And then from there, run tabletop exercises, right? Get an understanding for you get that phone call, that tweet, or whatever it is. Practice, fire drill it. Make sure you understand it. Test your product. Test
Hmm.
it internally. Make sure that it can survive a rudimentary automated pen test. And if you want to be better than compliance, hire some people to help you out with that. But you have to understand what those many steps are, or those many layers are that you can take and start taking action. And you might want to narrow it down to your top three.
Hmm.
Um, and,
Yeah.
and the conversation with your senior leadership and executives, because it all comes down to money.
Yeah.
It's never going to make you money, not in the short term. It might
Right.
protect your pocketbook and your bottom line long term in the event of an incident, that you will be able to minimize the impact of whatever happens. But it's never the if, it's always the when. So how
Right.
long will you wait before you get that ROI on your investment? Probably not as long as you'd like it to be.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, thanks. I think that's really helpful. It gives companies maybe a place to go, and I'll also make another plug for Device Authority. One of the things that we always talk about is being able to make updates at scale. So if
Mhm.
something were to happen, that was the only thing I would add to what you just said, and that is if and when something happens, how are you going to
Yeah.
update all of your devices that are out there in the wild already. That's pretty complex in automotive. And back when the GPAC happened, that was not easy
No.
for FCA to take care of.
So
So
we have made progress. I think it's
we've made a
important
lot of
to give
progress there. Yes.
kudos for the progress that has happened, but
Yes,
understand we still have a bit more to go.
we do. We do. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Jen. It was so great having you here.
My pleasure. Thank
Thanks
you.
for joining me. For us, everybody watching, I hope you got something out of this. We are having our coffee conversation here about cybersecurity and cyber physical systems. But if any questions come in, reach out through the platform. I think there's still the ability to ask questions afterwards. But thank you for your attention today. And thanks, Jen, for being here.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care, everybody.
Bye.